He believed rules were what kept order in the world. But in less than 5 minutes, those same rules would expose just how little he understood about power. The VIP security entrance at Terminal A gleamed under bright white lights, polished floors reflecting the steady stream of tailored suits, designer luggage, and first-class confidence. And Daniel Carter stood at his post like a gatekeeper of privilege, shoulders squared, uniform crisp, every movement precise as he scanned boarding passes and waved through only those who, in his judgment, belonged. It was a rhythm he trusted, a system that made sense, until she stepped forward. Eleanor Whitmore didn't look like anyone who should be there, not by the silent standards of that line. Her coat simple, slightly worn at the edges, her shoes practical instead of polished, her long gray-streaked hair falling loosely over her shoulders as she approached without hesitation, her expression calm, almost too calm for someone stepping into a space built on quiet exclusivity. Daniel noticed her immediately, the way trained eyes always picked out what didn't fit, and before she could cross the invisible boundary, he moved, firm and deliberate, blocking her path with a practiced step that had stopped countless others before her. "Ma'am, this line is for priority passengers only," he said, his voice controlled but loud enough to carry, enough for nearby travelers to glance over, their curiosity sparked by the subtle tension forming in the air. Eleanor didn't flinch, didn't argue, simply reached into her bag and handed him her boarding pass with steady hands, her eyes meeting his without challenge, without apology, and that alone unsettled him more than defiance ever could. He glanced at the ticket, barely a second, then handed it back, already certain of his judgment. "You'll need to use the standard security line," he added, gesturing toward the long queue stretching across the terminal, a line filled with tired travelers and impatient sighs. A faint murmur rippled through the nearby crowd, a couple exchanging knowing looks, someone whispering under their breath, the kind of quiet social verdict that always came before a moment turned public. Eleanor remained still, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, and for a brief second, something in the silence felt heavier than it should have, like a pause before a shift no one yet understood. Daniel straightened, confident, already moving on in his mind, unaware that in choosing who didn't belong, he had just made the one mistake that would redefine everything standing in front of him. Daniel had already moved on in his mind, but the quiet woman behind him had not moved at all, and that stillness began to draw attention in ways he did not expect. The line continued to flow, polished shoes stepping forward, boarding passes flashing under the scanner, yet a subtle shift had taken place, like a ripple spreading across a calm surface, and a few passengers slowed, their eyes drifting back toward Eleanor Whitmore, who remained exactly where he had left her, not in defiance, not in confusion, but in a kind of composed patience that did not belong in a moment of public dismissal. Daniel noticed it again, that lingering presence, and irritation flickered beneath his professional calm as he turned back, his voice sharper this time. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside and use the standard line." And he gestured more firmly, reinforcing the boundary he believed he controlled. A man in a tailored navy suit nearby smirked slightly, whispering something to his companion, while a woman with oversized sunglasses shook her head with quiet judgment, the social pressure building in. Small, invisible layers that Daniel had seen countless times before, moments where someone realized they were out of place and quietly retreated. But Eleanor did not retreat. She simply looked at him, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, and then, without raising her voice, she spoke. "I believe I am exactly where I am supposed to be." And the words, soft as they were, landed with an unexpected weight that caused a brief pause in the movement around them. Daniel felt it, that pause, that slight disruption of the order he maintained, and it tightened something in his chest, not doubt, but a stronger need to reassert control, to restore the balance he trusted. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled but firm. "This area is restricted, and I am asking you one last time to move." And this time, he reached for his radio, not pressing it yet, but making the gesture visible enough for others to notice, a signal that escalation was no longer a possibility, but an approaching certainty. The surrounding crowd grew quieter, the murmurs fading into a charged silence, eyes shifting between the uniformed authority and the woman who refused to be moved. and somewhere in the distance, a pair of hurried footsteps echoed across the polished floor, fast, urgent, out of rhythm with the calm efficiency of the terminal. But Daniel did not turn, not yet, because in his mind, this moment was already decided, and he had no idea that it was about to unravel in front of everyone watching. The sound of hurried footsteps grew louder, sharp against the polished marble floor, and this time Daniel noticed, his grip tightening slightly on his radio as he turned his head just enough to register a man in a dark suit moving quickly through the terminal with unmistakable urgency. His tie slightly loosened, his expression focused in a way that did not match the calm, controlled environment of the VIP lane. A few passengers stepped aside instinctively, sensing authority of a different kind, one that did not need to announce itself, and within seconds, the man reached them, stopping just short of Eleanor, his breath slightly uneven from the rush. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low but urgent, carrying a tone that immediately shifted the energy in the space, and Daniel frowned, his posture stiffening as he glanced between them, irritation flickering into confusion. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, turning briefly toward Daniel, but his attention returned to Eleanor almost instantly, as if she were the only person who mattered in that moment. Daniel straightened, regaining his composure, his voice firm again. "Sir, this area is restricted, and I am handling the situation." And there was a subtle emphasis on the word handling, a reminder of his authority, his control. The man's expression did not change, but something colder settled behind his eyes as he studied Daniel for a second longer than expected, then said carefully, "I understand that, but I believe there has been a misunderstanding." And the way he said misunderstanding made it sound less like a possibility and more like a certainty. Around them, the quiet tension deepened, conversations fading completely now as more people began to watch openly, sensing that something important was unfolding. Eleanor had not moved, had not raised her voice, had not even shifted her posture, yet the presence of the man beside her seemed to confirm what no one had yet said aloud. Daniel felt it again, that subtle imbalance, that crack in the structure he relied on, and it pushed him to respond more firmly. "There is no misunderstanding. She does not have priority clearance." And he gestured toward the standard line again, more sharply this time, determined to close the moment before it slipped further out of his control. The man inhaled slowly, as if choosing his next words with precision, then glanced at Eleanor, who gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, and when he turned back to Daniel, his voice dropped just enough to carry weight without volume. "Do you have any idea who you were speaking to?" The question hung in the air, heavier than anything that had been said so far, and for the first time, Daniel did not answer immediately, because something in the silence told him that whatever came next would not follow the rules he thought he understood. Daniel felt the weight of the question settle into the space between them, and for a brief moment, the confidence that had guided every decision he made that morning hesitated, not enough to show weakness, but enough to sharpen his tone as he responded. "I am speaking to someone who does not have authorization for this lane." And his words came out clean, controlled, as if repeating protocol would restore the certainty he had just felt slipping. The man in the suit held his gaze for a second, longer, then exhaled slowly, a quiet release that carried something close to disbelief, before stepping slightly to the side, revealing Eleanor more fully to the growing circle of onlookers who had now stopped, pretending not to watch. "Ma'am," he said again, softer this time, almost respectful, and there was a subtle shift in his posture, shoulders lowering, voice losing its urgency and gaining something else entirely, something measured, deliberate. Eleanor finally moved, but only slightly, adjusting the strap of her bag, her eyes never leaving Daniel, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, the kind of calm that did not come from uncertainty, but from complete control. "It seems there is some confusion," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a quiet authority that did not need to rise above the silence to be heard. Daniel felt a flicker of irritation return, stronger now, fueled by the watching crowd, by the expectation that he would resolve this, restore order, prove that the system worked exactly as it should. He lifted his radio slightly, this time pressing the button, his voice firm as he spoke into it, requesting supervisory assistance, a final step that, in his mind, would settle everything once and for all. The response came quickly, a confirmation, and within seconds, another presence approached, slower, more deliberate than the first, a senior operations manager known across the terminal for his precision and authority. And as he stepped into view, something unexpected happened. His eyes landed on Eleanor, and for a fraction of a second, his expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for everyone to notice, but enough for those paying attention to feel it, that sudden recognition that alters everything in an instant. He stopped, just short of the group, his posture straightening, his tone shifting before he even spoke. "Ma'am," he said carefully, and this time there was no urgency, no confusion, only clarity. "We have been trying to reach you." The words settled over the scene like a quiet revelation, and Daniel's hand, still holding the radio, froze mid-motion, because in that single sentence, the balance of power had already begun to turn, even if he had not yet fully understood why. The words hung in the air, simple and quiet, but they carried a gravity that no one could ignore, and in that instant, the entire atmosphere of the VIP lane shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a subtle, unmistakable change that moved through the crowd like a silent wave. The senior operations manager stood straighter now, his attention fixed entirely on Eleanor Whitmore, no longer glancing at Daniel, no longer acknowledging the process that had just unfolded, and that alone was enough to make something tighten in Daniel's chest. "We have been trying to reach you," the manager repeated, his voice respectful, measured, as if each word had been carefully chosen, and Eleanor gave a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement that required no explanation, no apology, only quiet understanding. Daniel blinked once, then again, his mind working quickly to reassemble the situation into something that still made sense, but the structure he relied on was no longer holding. He stepped forward slightly, his voice controlled but edged with confusion. "Sir, I was following protocol. She does not have the required clearance." And the words sounded thinner now, less certain, as if even he could hear the gap between what he was saying and what was unfolding in front of him. The manager turned his head slowly, meeting Daniel's eyes for the first time since arriving, and there was no anger in his expression, no raised voice, just a steady, unspoken question that seemed to ask how this moment had been allowed to happen. Around them, the silence deepened, the earlier whispers gone, replaced by a focused stillness as every nearby passenger watched openly now, sensing that something far more significant than a simple misunderstanding was taking place. Eleanor adjusted her bag again, her movements calm, unhurried, completely untouched by the tension surrounding her, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same quiet composure that had unsettled Daniel from the beginning. "There is no need for concern," she said, her tone even, almost gentle, and yet the effect was immediate, as if her words had the power to settle the entire space without effort. The manager nodded again, more firmly this time, then took a small step back, giving her space in a way that signaled respect rather than authority, and in that movement, something became unmistakably clear. Daniel felt it before he fully understood it, that shift in position, in power, in perception, and his hand, still holding the radio, slowly lowered to his side as a realization began to form, incomplete but impossible to ignore, that the woman he had just dismissed did not belong outside the system he was protecting. She stood above it, and whatever came next would not be a correction of process, but a revelation of something far greater than he had ever considered. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the polished floor and the watching crowd like a quiet verdict that had already been decided, and Daniel could feel it now in a way he had never felt before, not as authority, but as exposure, as if every assumption he had made just moments ago was being laid out in front of him without a single word needing to be spoken. The senior operations manager stepped slightly closer to Eleanor, lowering his voice just enough to carry respect rather than urgency. "Your car is ready on the tarmac, ma'am, and the board has been waiting for your confirmation." And the phrasing was careful, deliberate, the kind used only for someone whose decisions carried weight far beyond a single terminal, far beyond a single flight. A subtle shift moved through the onlookers, a realization forming piece by piece, and the man in the tailored navy suit who had smirked earlier now straightened, his expression tightening as he glanced between Daniel and Eleanor, as if recalculating everything he thought he understood about the moment. Daniel felt his throat dry slightly, his posture still upright but no longer anchored in certainty, and he forced his voice to remain steady as he spoke again. Though this time the words felt heavier. Sir, I was simply enforcing access regulations. And even as he said it, the statement sounded smaller, reduced to something procedural in the presence of what was unfolding. The manager did not respond immediately, instead glancing briefly at Eleanor, who gave the slightest nod once more, and then he turned back to Daniel with a calm that was far more unsettling than anger. Of course, he said, his tone even, and those regulations exist to serve the people who build and lead this airline. And the emphasis was subtle, but it landed with unmistakable clarity. The words seemed to pause in the air, connecting pieces that Daniel had not yet fully assembled, and then, almost as an afterthought, the manager added, "This is Ms. Eleanor Whitmore." And he did not need to say more, because the name itself carried a weight that began to ripple outward, recognized by those who knew, questioned by those who did not, but undeniable in its presence. Daniel's mind caught up a second too late, the recognition hitting not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, sinking realization that spread through his chest, tightening his breath as everything aligned in a way he could no longer deny. And for the first time since the moment began, he had nothing to say. Eleanor looked at him then, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a steady, composed gaze that held something far more powerful. And in that gaze, Daniel understood that the line he had been guarding so carefully was never meant to keep her out. It existed because of her. The name settled over the space with a quiet finality, and the effect was immediate, subtle at first, then unmistakable, as recognition spread through the faces of those who understood exactly who Eleanor Whitmore was, while those who did not began to sense it from the reactions around them. The shift in posture, the sudden respect that replaced curiosity, the way even the ambient noise of the terminal seemed to pull back, as if the environment itself was adjusting to her presence. Daniel stood motionless, the weight of the moment pressing down on him in a way he had never experienced before, not loud, not chaotic, but precise, controlled, and impossible to escape. And he replayed every second in his mind, every word, every gesture, every assumption that had led him here, each one now stripped of certainty and exposed for what it was. The senior operations manager stepped aside slightly, creating a clear path forward, and the message in that movement did not need explanation. It was an invitation, not granted, but returned, as if acknowledging that the space had always belonged to her. Eleanor took a step forward, calm and unhurried, her shoes making a soft sound against the polished floor, and no one moved to stop her this time. No one questioned, no one spoke, because the answer to every unasked question was already standing in front of them. Daniel felt the instinct to say something, anything, to correct, to explain, to recover the control he had lost, but the words did not come, and in their absence, the silence grew heavier, more defining, until it became its own kind of statement. Eleanor paused just briefly as she passed him, not long enough to create a scene, but long enough for the moment to register, her eyes meeting his once more, steady, composed, and in that brief exchange, there was no anger, no need for confrontation, only a quiet awareness that said everything that needed to be said. Then she continued forward, stepping into the priority lane without resistance, without announcement, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the system had simply corrected itself around her. Behind her, the manager followed at a respectful distance, already speaking softly into his phone, coordinating what came next, while the crowd slowly began to move again, the flow of the terminal resuming, but not quite the same as before. Daniel remained where he was, the uniform still perfectly in place, the posture still upright, but something had shifted beneath the surface, something that would not be undone by routine or protocol. And as the line began to form again in front of him, he understood with quiet clarity that the role he believed defined power had never truly been power at all, and that realization lingered longer than any words ever could. The line began to move again, but the rhythm had changed, quieter now, more measured, as if every person passing through that space carried a new awareness they could not quite explain, and Daniel stood at his post, performing the same motions, scanning passes, nodding, stepping aside. Yet nothing felt the same, because the certainty that once guided each decision had been replaced by something far less comfortable, a lingering question that refused to settle. A few passengers glanced at him differently now, not openly, not with judgment, but with a subtle shift in perception, as if they had seen something they would remember long after their flights departed, and even those who had not fully understood what had happened could feel that something important had unfolded in front of them. In the distance, Eleanor continued forward, her pace steady, unhurried, as she moved beyond the checkpoint and into the secured corridor, the senior manager still a step behind her, speaking quietly, coordinating details that now seemed far more significant than a routine departure. And for a brief moment, she paused again, not because she needed to, but because she chose to. She turned slightly, her gaze drifting back toward the checkpoint, toward the man who had stood so firmly in her path just minutes earlier. And though the distance between them was now several yards, the connection in that glance was unmistakable. Daniel felt it instantly, the same steady presence, the same composed awareness. But this time there was something more, not judgment, not disappointment, but a quiet expectation, as if the moment itself had become a lesson that did not require explanation. She did not raise her voice, did not call attention to herself, but when she spoke, her words carried clearly across the space, calm, measured, and impossible to ignore. Rules are important, she said, her tone even, but they are only as strong as the understanding behind them. And then she held his gaze for just a second longer before turning away, continuing down the corridor without waiting for a response. The words settled into Daniel's mind with a weight that grew heavier the longer he stood there, and for the first time, he did not immediately return to routine, did not reset into the familiar pattern, because something in that moment had interrupted it completely. The terminal continued around him, announcements echoing overhead, footsteps crossing the marble floor, but beneath it all, a new awareness remained, quiet but persistent, and Daniel understood that what had happened was not just a mistake, it was a reflection, one that would follow him long after the shift ended, long after the uniform came off, because some lessons do not arrive with noise or consequence. They arrive in silence, and they stay. The rest of the shift passed in a way that Daniel could not quite explain. The same steady flow of passengers, the same routine movements. Yet each action felt slightly altered, as if the meaning behind it had shifted without changing its form. And though no one spoke directly about what had happened, it lingered in the space, in the glances exchanged between travelers, in the subtle quiet that followed each interaction, as if the memory of that moment had settled into the walls themselves. Hours later, as the terminal lights softened and the rush of departures slowed, Daniel finally stepped away from his post, the crisp lines of his uniform still intact, but the confidence that once filled it now replaced by something quieter, something more reflective. He walked past the same VIP lane he had guarded all day, pausing just briefly, his eyes tracing the path where Eleanor had stood, where she had waited without anger, without urgency, and he realized that nothing about her had demanded respect. She had simply carried it with her, and that was what made the difference. In the distance, beyond the glass, a private aircraft prepared for departure, its lights glowing softly against the darkening sky. And though he could not see her, he knew she was there, moving forward as if the moment had never disrupted her day at all. He thought back to the words she had spoken, not as a reprimand, but as something far more enduring, something that did not accuse, but revealed, and the realization settled deeper now, no longer sharp, but steady, like a truth that would not fade. The uniform, the rules, the authority he had relied on were still there, still necessary, still part of the system that kept everything moving. But they were no longer the full picture, and for the first time, he understood that the real measure of his role was not in who he stopped, but in how he saw the people standing in front of him. The next morning would come, the line would form again, and he would stand in the same place, performing the same duties, but something fundamental had changed, something that would shape every decision from that moment forward. Because some lessons do not arrive with consequences or commands, they arrive in quiet clarity, and they remain long after the moment has passed. And as the terminal lights dimmed and the last announcement echoed through the space, Daniel